My name's O'Shea Bowens, and today we're going to go into a topic that it has a very long title, but it will make sense hopefully towards the end. And it's pushing the stock left to achieve Nash equilibrium. A quick rundown. There's really about four sections we're really going to cover. Questions being the fourth, not really the intro. I don't consider intro a big section. No one cares about me, so yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. Yeah, so who am I? Yeah, he already mentioned that, O'Shea Bowens. I'm up in Boston, so if you're ever around the Boston area, you can typically find me either around Boston Security Meetup, which is the third Thursday of every month, DC 617, or typically out somewhere in the New England area snowboarding. So it's usually something along those lines. And I'm also one of the board of directors for Blacks in Cyber. So why the title? I'll go a bit more into my background, but essentially most of my I'd say a huge portion of my cyber career has been in the defensive space, so not necessarily red teaming, but blue teaming. And when I was thinking about, going more into AppSec, somehow this just dawned upon me. But if you're unfamiliar with uh, J- uh, John Nash, is essentially a really, really famous mathematician. If you ever saw the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, that's essentially the character that he played. And he has something that I believe was his thesis title, which led him down the path of obtaining his PhD, which is game theory. And essentially, the genesis of game theory is more strategic based. So essentially, it is focusing on the fact that inside of a competition, if one player were to make an adjustment to their strategy and change and move to a different action, then the opposing player or their teammate may actually lose out, right? So essentially, one change in one faction of the competition or within the environment produces a secondary action as a loss or change for the second person. But if neither changes, then essentially both win. Or if they change in a synchronous manner, then both win. And that's kind of the way I envision. I guess it's 2020. 2020 has been a weird year, but that's over the last 3 or 4 years. That's the way I envision the relationship between security operations or the SOC and AppSec. So I will say I'm not an AppSec person. I've been learning a bit, and this is kind of me sharing what I've learned. But as a person that's had to manage and build security operations from the ground up, either like in director positions or from a consultancy perspective, I typically see this weird disalignment, right? If you're unfamiliar with a SOC or a security operations center, the simple version of it, at least my version of it, is really this amazing place where you combine numerous individuals with numerous skill sets that allow you to grow and learn in a very rapid pace. I always tell individuals that are looking to get into security that if you want to ramp up and grow in different areas, or specifically if you're unsure which area you're going to go into, take a look at finding a security operations position, because you're going to be introduced to so many different facets of security that you're likely to find something that you really enjoy. Um, at its basis, keeping things super simple. I'm a super person, right? I mean, I'm a simple person. So I like to think about things in regards to like three buckets when it comes to security. That's monitoring, detection, and response. Monitoring being, one of the most important areas around identification and logging. There's numerous talks, on YouTube that you can find around what happens when logging goes astray, right? Typically, logging goes astray, an incident occurs, and you have no way to fully recover or fully identify what actually happened, right? So always focus on logging. If you had to look at the three of these, focus on your logging, focus on tagging, and understanding your data sources. Outside of monitoring, you have detection and response. So just what they sound like, right? Detection, the ability to detect. Response, your capabilities and ability to respond to an event or an incident. So, what actually went wrong in the SOC? In the beginning, as I was writing this out, it really turned into like this SOC bashing talk, and I didn't want to go that route. So I had to adjust, right? But when I think about what potentially went wrong or what went wrong in the SOC, I think it was really just an introduction to security where we're not really included. And I don't mean like a woe is me type of thing. I think typically when you look at like AppSec and DevOps, even AppSec, I've seen programs where AppSec is outside of the security apparatus, where individuals within the SOC aren't communicating with individuals that are responsible for AppSec. DevOps most definitely outside the SOC apparatus, but I think and I envision a world where you combine these two and you do some amazing stuff. So what is DevOps? I know this is an AppSec conference, so I'm gonna put on the imagination hat and imagine there's a few people there that have no idea what DevOps are, right? If you're super intertwined with AppSec and DevOps, and I'm sorry, just bear with me for a few minutes. But essentially, the simple version of DevOps is a really, at least again, the way I look at it, is really the barriers between software development and IT operations. So it allows you to accomplish it allows you to just move in a much more rapid fashion, especially if you're responsible for an application that you're selling from an organization or from a business perspective that you maybe need to scale up due to demand from users, or scale down, or make rapid changes for improvements. You would likely look to something in the DevOps shop. Those are the individuals that you would communicate with in regards to that scaling up and scaling down. DevOps is, the more I began to read into it about a year and a half ago, the more simpler it became to me. In the very beginning, if you're new to understanding DevOps, it is super complex, and I don't know anyone that would say it's very easy to just pick up. But I started breaking things down into little packages or buckets that made it easy for me to digest. Once you begin to kind of understand those, if you're unfamiliar with the DevOps side of IT, things begin to become much more simpler, especially when it's time to add on the security operations side of things. You'll hear CI/CD or DevOps pipeline, and what essentially that is the ability to keep. I think one of the key words here is kind of seamless, and to have that continuous integration and continuous development. So what does that look like? And to accomplish this, you need different things. You need some type of framework for continuous integration and development. You need some source control management. You need some batch or build automation tools, web application server, and some type of code testing coverage. That's really it. I'm sure it could get much more complex, but again, we're playing the simple game. And the simple game allows you to move into a space where you are deploying multiple times a day. I think one of the bigger I know one of the bigger challenges related to DevOps when you think about security, is how do you place those traditional controls inside of the development on the development side of operations, right? If you're deploying, once or twice a week, yeah, that's pretty easy. You can throw some of the traditional vulnerability management tools in EDR solutions or IDSs or SIEMs into the mix, right? But when you're deploying, and these are some old numbers from the Amazon and Google perspective, but we'll say, Amazon at 23,000 times a day, the old ways of doing things just don't cut it anymore. You need to get a bit more creative. And when you begin to think about this, this is, again, keeping it super simple, is, the birth of AppSec, right? So how do you combine security into the development process of creating applications and deploying those? Again, try to keep it simple. A lot of this can get overly complicated. I look at it from the term, going back to buckets, right? So those three different buckets. Well, what do you need to be successful in AppSec? Well, you need code, right? Bad code is what introduces a problem for many of us that are incident responders. When we're called in to investigate, there's a chance that it's either A, based upon a horrible config from a system and network perspective, or A or B, or C, it's bad code. Bad code allowed the defender to find a vulnerability, which they exploited and somehow ran wild inside the environment and potentially exfilled data. And now you're on Curbs on Security or you're on CNN. But from an AppSec perspective, the reason you care is not too different from system and network side of caring. It's because your job is to defend. You need to protect a particular asset or an arena within the company where the security budget begins to filter down some of those dollars, right? So I think another area on this side of things, and I'll dive into this a bit later, that also complicates security operations or the traditional SOCs understanding AppSec, is really we don't understand the tools that are leveraged for AppSec. Again, outside of our window, and we're not totally introduced to it. And then the third aspect is just, how do you tackle it? How do you understand the landscape? Again, keep in mind, or keep something in the front of your mind from a networking systems perspective. How do I begin to apply that line of thinking towards AppSec? When you look at, and I think this is super important to start looking into now, honestly, because when you look at, what's been happening from a cybercrime perspective, from a breach perspective, uh, what you're seeing is a lot of breaches a lot of breaches. The causation is somewhere around DevOps, or somewhere around crappy controls around AppSec, or just misalignments with whatever your cloud security provider with, loose policies, leaky secrets, keys being dumped, things along those lines, right? And it's becoming more and more popular. We know this because the bad people are taking advantage of this. You have different threat actors and different hackers taking advantage of this, and now it's becoming much more populous in things like Verizon's DBIR report, or our data breach investigations report. In 2017, 2018, that was like 10-20%. Now it's like 40% of the breaches, when they look at breaches that were investigated from start to finish. A part of that was due to uh, just crappy code or crappy controls around code related automation tools, or the cloud provider. So now we understand what the problem is. We're going to think about it from a SOC perspective. We're thinking, okay, well, how do we jump into this? How do I, as a security analyst, I, as an incident responder, or I mean, even I, as a threat hunter, begin to really understand what I can do here and how I can help kind of solve this for my organization? Or if you're a researcher, how I can begin learning more about this. There's a few different areas that you're going to have to start to become familiar with. Uh, from a static code testing perspective and dynamic code perspective. Again, keeping it simple. These are tools that you would leverage inside of an application security program, or to solve a challenge from an AppSec perspective. Static being understanding where vulnerabilities could potentially be introduced within the code. Having some type of program that runs line by line. Dynamic, looking for vulnerabilities from a running application. There are two models that I think we're fairly familiar with. One of them we are definitely familiar with, penetration testing, but threat modeling and penetration testing. I think if you're beginning to learn this, you need to incorporate this into your day-to-day operations. Starting with one of these two will help kind of lead you down the path, and I'll dive a bit more into that. Some of the DAS and SAS tools out there. I'm not a vendor. I try not to. I try to be vendor agnostic as much as I can. So, but these are just some of the tools that you can look to leverage from a DAS and SAS output. I'm sure there's many more out there. There are many more you've heard of today. But what I normally suggest is taking a look at one or two of those and beginning to dive deep there. Look at some of the FAQs. Find maybe the subpage on Reddit. Find some Slack channels where individuals are leveraging these, or find Slack channels around AppSec or threat hunting, whatever it may be, where you can get a bit more advice and ramp up fairly quickly. The first step to anything in life is just try it. So grab it and try it. So how do we push left? Throughout this talk, what I'll do is kind of walk through an example of essentially pushing left. So that's, again, beginning to think about, okay, well, how can I incorporate, when you think about the traditional aspects of pushing left, that's really introducing security controls into the application and development lifecycle. What we're thinking about is, how do I begin to introduce SOC operations, pieces of SOC operations into AppSec, into DevOps, and building out more of an AppSec, or gaining the introductory skills and knowledge into AppSec. So what I've done here is I just built out a pretty simple application for testing purposes. It's just an application written in PHP, not too dissimilar from what you may find. Well, I hope it's not a Fortune 100 company that has an app written in PHP, but essentially just a app written in PHP that's a restaurant review, that's responsible for restaurant reviews. Going back to threat modeling, again, things we're super familiar with in the SOC, right? So from a threat modeling perspective, there's a few questions we ask ourselves. What are we concerned about, and what are we concerned about from introducing vulnerabilities and being able to actually understand where we can interject security controls, and really, what are we going to do about it? Keeping it simple. So we begin to prioritize those concerns, not too different from what we've done in threat modeling, right? some of the concerns are, what if someone were to expose this from a public perspective? What does that do to our reputation? Internally, what type of SaaS products can we use to help solve these problems? Are there any cloud services we need to be concerned about inside of our threat model? It's vulnerability detection. So again, keeping with pushing left. Again, if you were to take the steps you would normally move through for exploiting a target, or exploiting a system or a box, keep that same process in mind when it's related to AppSec. I know there's different complexities here. I'm not going to pretend that finding a vulnerability in an application is the same as finding a vulnerability in a Cisco switch or on a Ubuntu box. But the premise is the same, right? We're looking for a vulnerability. We need an exploit. We need payload. We need to somehow infect that or deploy that payload. And from that attack, we need to find a way to exfil our data or completely destroy the target. If you're a professional, you're likely not just going to destroy because there's no money there. So how realistic is this? Well, it's fairly realistic, I think. What we've done is kind of simulate some of the vulnerabilities here, but we are going to walk through it just as if it was a real system or a real application. So what do we know? Super small app, super vulnerable. Great. So what are some of the first steps we would do, again, as we're walking through this from a traditional pin step or threat modeling or assessment side of things? Well, we're going to scan. We're all used to scanning. We all know what Nmap is. It's been around since we were 14 years old, right? But you're not going to use an Nmap here. You need something along the lines of static or dynamic analysis. One of those scanners through one of the tools that we spoke about earlier. So once we've actually scanned statically, we begin to identify some vulnerabilities. Great. This lets us know we're heading down the right path. To double down on this, if we have the actual application, we're going to scan dynamically too. We're going to get some output there. Again, this is just really telling us like what's wrong with the app. It doesn't mean everything's going to be exploitable, but it does again keep you down that path, especially if you've done any type of threat hunting or pen testing before. Now that we looked at the report, what do we want to do? Well, crap, we want to exploit it, right? So we really need to go back to our threat model, again, answer those questions around what do we care about, how can we fix it, and how long will vulnerabilities live? I should be careful with how long vulnerabilities live as a question you would answer as a tester, or even to someone in the SOC. Most likely that's someone in risk or GRC that's asking that. Once you actually have this information, I think it's time to sit down within your SOC, with other team members, and begin to kind of purple team this. You put some people together. Hopefully, some of you have some defensive skills, some have offensive skills, and now you're beginning to kind of run through this from an attack perspective. There's one of the things I love to do that that's happened over the last 3 or 4 years, and that's happened specifically over this year when it comes to application security, is really beginning to take what I know as a person that's been on the defensive side for a very long time and apply that to this and look at the different types of results that I'm able to come up with, right? I always say I'm a pretty crappy attacker. I'm a pretty crappy red teamer, but I know some great red teamers that I've become friends with. So becoming a better attacker has helped me become a better defender. I'm sure you heard many people say this. I definitely believe it's true. So in this scenario, I'm just putting on the red team hat. I'm putting on my attacker hat, and we're going to run down and try to exploit the application. So here we know, going back to some of the vulnerabilities that we identified, there was some PHP vulnerabilities there, and there's also a local file inclusion vulnerability that we were able to exploit. So all we were looking to do is really understand, hey, can we drop something there that allows us to return commands from the URL bar against the machine, right? So we're just going to type in some simple, really simple command, look for something in return, and then we know we're off to the races. And that's sign number one. These are super things you can do. There's a lot of vulnerable applications you can find on the web too. So yeah, great. Now we know we're good. There's also vulnerable applications you can find online that allow you to do this. I just needed something I could build out myself because, again, it helps me get better with my coding skills too. But grab something online and try this stuff out. If the vulnerability works, all we're looking to do now is drop a secondary payload, ensure that can beacon out to another server that's within the attack environment. Once we're actually able to receive that secondary connection outside the environment, we're looking to go back and drop like a keylogger, drop another payload that allows us to uh, zip up data from the database we're able to navigate to, zip that up, and then now we can move into more nefarious activity like selling it or um, maybe destroying the machine. Again, I think most professionals out there, when you encounter a lot of it, they're not necessarily looking to destroy. They're looking to find a hook, hang out, collect as much data as humanly possible while they're flying under the radar, and then eventually sell that. So these are from being ready for either from a short period of time. Now, again, taking what you know from the SOC, the red teaming, your defensive side of moving, run this against an application. When you're thinking about pushing left, you have to kind of ask yourself around another question, not just from the static and dynamic perspective around understanding the tools you can leverage. You also have to go back to we are individuals that are primarily here for defensive purposes most of the time within the SOC. Usually the people that are focusing on C&D, computer network defense, or blue teaming are going to outnumber individuals that are associated with red teaming. So it always comes back to again, those three pillars: monitoring, detection, and response. So now that we know that it's possible to exploit the application, we have to think about how can we build out some type of detection and response capabilities, and also monitoring. From a monitoring perspective, again, I'm not I don't sell tools, so I put down tools that I like to use. OSEC is still one of those. The Sysmon config by Swiss on Security is still kind of like top in my mind. Leveraging like OS query. I know there's been some weird activity with OS query over the last couple of days, to say the least. But again, thinking about how can I build this out so I can move into those three pillars of security. Once I have those, do I understand really what the builds look like that are actually deploying these packages within my environment? Something that I would say it took me a few months to really begin to understand was really the different types of deployment packages that are deployment options that you have available. Going from Jenkins to Ansible to Packer, or leveraging like our tools within Azure, or leveraging like Lambda. Like Lambda is something that I don't know why I really like it all of a sudden now. Maybe because it's like written in Python or something. But beginning to understand how I can introduce like a bro agent, or like a bro agent that I can drop on a box inside of. I mean, I can drop on like within ECS and AWS as a dependency within a build. It's just like really, really cool to me. I know this isn't just me, but I know a lot of people struggle with, especially if you don't have the AppSec and the DevOps background. A lot of people struggle with, how do I begin to introduce security controls into my development lifecycle, right? If it's not there from the initial build, what do? I can't deploy SO on every single box within the environment. So you have to kind of like think about non-traditional ways to get what you need, essentially. And beginning to learn the different deployment tools is a great way to approach that, I think. You can't really talk too much. Do a talk these days without mentioning an attack miter. I won't go too deep into this because I've done a few talks on this side of it. But what I will say is, with the release of sub techniques, with some of the work like Roberto Rodriguez has done around Helk and integrating attack miter into daily operations, there's so much research out there that allows you to really understand how do you, again, taking those three buckets: monitoring, detection, and response. How do I take that and align that to MITRE? And being that my attack is a framework in and of itself, there's also an added bonus here in regards to thinking of how can I take how can I move from red teaming or purple teaming to building out countermeasures from a defensive perspective, and then linking that to some area of risk, or applying that to like my risk register of I think that this part is super important when you begin to ask these questions, because when you are feeding things up to management, whether those are your OKRs or MBOs, whatever it may be, however you perform your matrix within your environment, management needs to see something that is convertible to risk. That's what they care about, right? So it's great that we find vulnerabilities. It's great that we're able to fix them. High five and pat on the back to us. But what management has to report up to the executive suite is really understanding the vulnerabilities that currently exist, our countermeasures and controls around those, and how often these shift. That's how you begin to win. That's how you essentially begin to win as you move up. I want to say up the chain, but really throughout your career, taking on more responsibility, especially from like a management side of things. And just what I have is just a quick kind of like reference in regards to how separate these things may be, how separate these particular items are in regards to responsibilities and different teams. But the one thing I want people to take away from this talk is you're all on the same team, right? It does me no good to look at what the DevOps team is doing and say, well, that's not really my problem unless something goes wrong. I think that is like by far one of the worst or selfish approaches you could take as a security practitioner. I don't care whether you're on offense or defense. I think to be this well-rounded individual from a security perspective, you have to begin to think about problems before they present themselves to you. You have to really understand what other teams are up to really jump in front of potential issues that may come bite you in the butt down the line. I know I can say from like personal experience doing a lot of incident response and security analytics work, if only I had known that, going back a few years, of course, but if only I had known that this particular system with vulnerabilities was still being deployed, or this particular system with vulnerabilities was accessible, even though we are behind a proxy or behind a firewall, it was only like one layer deep or one layer down, right? If only I had known that this particular part of the network was actually open to handling these type of queries. There's a bunch of, I can think about throughout my career, a bunch of, if only I had known. And, I'm a bit older now. So now when I sit down with a client and I'm trying to understand their security landscape and their security program, especially just in general their IT operations, there's a lot of questions I ask around. Okay, cool. What do you do for DevOps? Cool. What's your vulnerability management team look like? Okay, cool. What's your network look like? I ask a much broader list of questions because I've been on the receiving end of not having answers for those and being called in a bit too late. And if you've had to work an incident, it's not this there's nothing glamorous about it. I'll put it that way. It is a very stressful time period. um, and as I began to incorporate and build out my knowledge around DevOps, of something I begin to read about and something I begin to kind of really try to build into security offerings, or when I'm consulting with different individuals. And that's actually a tool I'm trying to build. Another topic, but around the DevOps side of things is really, when I'm asking questions around pipelines and images, is really, the people that I see that are performing well or that are minimizing risk really have kind of what they call a golden image, or a gold, pretty much like a golden image. And what that essentially is one configuration of one particular OS, one particular set of dependencies that doesn't really change too often, right? If you were to again put on, your back in the day hat, even not back in the day, but from in some sense, what do we do when we need to throw up a new system or a new server, right? When you think about when you're throwing out an IIS server, from a security perspective, you're going to try to harden that. Think about hardening that IIS server is essentially, creating this golden image from a DevOps side of things, right? Ideally, the people I see that are doing this very well, very coherently, and it's trackable. Trackable being a big part of this is, there's always some level of auditing attached to it in regards to really understanding, okay, who has keys to actually make updates. If there's something in Jenkins that changes, how can we limit the access controls there? Well, it doesn't have to be Jenkins; it could be another tool, but really limiting those controls there and creating some type of log or audit for that. And I think that's, the more I've seen this, the more awesome I think it is. And I think this is going to become pretty much a standard across much of DevOps. So if you're working in the SOC, or if you're running a security program, you're a manager, you're a director, whatever you may be, these are questions that you may want to start peek over the fence and ask the individuals in charge of DevOps, right, or individuals on the AppSec team. Begin to have them incorporate this into some of their matrix. outside of like having golden images. Another thing that I've seen a couple companies do that they do really well, this which kind of piques my interest in me understanding what more can I do from a security perspective, is really building out more like of golden like pipelines, right? So that's essentially understanding and allowing different pull requests to make changes, but you have a very small few a small list of individuals that have these capabilities. The game doesn't really change all that much from a security perspective. It's still about access control, still about limiting risk and exposure, and still about managing vulnerabilities. Now you just have to focus on applying that to a lot of your automation and deployment tools from a DevOps perspective. Another area that, again, pushing left, if you're in the SOC, that I would begin to take interest with or begin to kind of peek my head over the fence and start to ask more questions is really understanding microcontainers. There is just it's it's amazing how quickly threat actors just adjusted lately, especially in this day and age. But what you're starting to see now is, okay, well, it's not so much about me as XYZ bad person attempting to pop a shell on this box. What I really want to try to understand is, hey, there is a vulnerable Docker instance, floating around because someone used default configuration, and you can find it and simply just leveraging like Shodan, right? Okay, now that I know that this Docker instance is running default configuration, what are the chances that it's using default credentials? Okay, well, if it's using default credentials and I get in, what the heck can I do? Can I swap out maybe an image? Could I throw some some headless VM inside of that Docker container? Something that we saw with the guys, or I'm saying guys, but the people that built the Maze ransomware. This is kind of what they were doing, not necessarily from a pure Docker perspective. What they were doing is leveraging headless VMs, deploying those, hiding those across like Windows macros. And once it's actually running in the background inside of some type of weird executable, it hooks into another process and makes a call out, brings down the payload, then boom, it executes across your environment. Right? Imagine being in a position like that, but due to an image from your Docker containers, right? As an incident responder, that's not one of the first places we innately go look. So it's something you have to think about from a security perspective, especially if you're in the SOC, in regards to understanding what the heck is going on with the DevOps folks. When I think about, well, again, how do you push left? It's really looking for a few components. If you have a golden image or golden pipeline, and that's out of compliance or introduces a vulnerability, then you break the build, right? Breaking the build is a hard thing to sell to teams. So you're going to have to work on your approach, almost like landing a plane. You got to work on your approach before you can just come in and say, hey guys, hey girls, if there's any type of vulnerabilities that exist within your packages, you're going to have to break the whole thing and go back to zero, right? You're going to have to work with them on this. So don't take this as what Shay says, break the build as, destroy, start screwing with their pipeline and delaying working projects. Like, don't look at it that way. Sit down, communicate, over communicate. Interpersonal communication is one of the biggest things I think is missing from that means in simple English, speaking from person to person, understanding what your day looks like, you and my day looks like. When you do that, you can accomplish a lot more. And if I had to place this as like more of a visualization, you introduce steps that we just spoke about. I think you avoid, banging the keyboard against the screen to move to the Zen where you understand, okay, from dev to QA to pre-prod to production as a security, I know where the breaks are and I know where deployments are happening. I keep clearing anytime there's like an event or security incident, and understand when's the last something to deploy with our environment. When was the last time ability was actually introduced on the DevOps pipeline? I can start to answer these questions myself because I built that rapport with the DevOps team, ask them more questions, and I can incorporate that into the security program. Again, something I recommend, dedicating if you're a manager or director, this is going to be a bit harder for you to pull off because you got other stuff to do. But dedicating a SOC resource to sit down with these other teams, learn more about start learning about GitHub, start learning about Docker, start learning about Lambda, start learning about these different tools that are out there. If it's going to take you a while to ramp up on the tools, CIS has a pretty good benchmark document for Docker that's out there. CIS is starting to produce more things around Jenkins and other just like they always do, right? They always cover massive parts of IT operations that you can leverage for hardening. So start to look for documentation and research that could help you bring these conversations about if you're unfamiliar with these areas. Because I know that's personally what I did. Adjust your SOC charter to incorporate more security practices within AppSec. Get involved, ask questions. There was a manager I had named Casey Laxton at a company called Toast here in Boston, and he would always say, "I'd rather over communicate than under communicate with you," and it's something that kind of stuck with me. So find a way to over communicate your needs as a defender, a blue team, or an individual in the SOC with DevOps. And with that, yeah, I'll take questions.
All right. Thank you, and for that presentation, O'Shea. So for questions at this time, one of the first things here is that you offer a lot of different information and ways to approach this, pushing left. And so would you consider this like to be like a functional model like here? Because there's a lot of different things here. Is it like more of a framework? I guess how would you try and have other teams try to interpret this and take this back?
That's a good question. The short answer is I'm creating this as a framework because that's not the first time someone's asked me that. And usually the second question is how do I implement this? So it's usually the very next thing that follows. So I mean, I look at it as a practice. Hopefully by April or March of next year, I'll have like a framework out around this. Maybe someone's going to beat me to it. In reality, I look at it as almost like a best practice, right? The simple way I would approach this or share it would be if you as a security practitioner can't answer questions in regards to how things are deployed within your environment, then that's the simplest sign that you need to get involved, right? And I'm happy to answer more questions about this in Twitter or whatever, or emails. But I think this would have to be some type of framework so more people can begin to incorporate it. Because I looked around for something like this for a while and I couldn't find it. So I began to have to write this out. And that's what led to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like there's, a lot of different ways to approach it with the framework and not necessarily to go into like that follow-up question, but from the ones that you offered here for teams looking to implement this, kind of start going down that path, what would you say is like the quickest win or like the question that they need to be able to answer first when pushing left?
Yeah, I think so. I almost have to mention the vendor, but so understanding vulnerabilities and dependencies is probably one of the easiest things you can do, simply because you can integrate that with Jenkins, or you can integrate that inside of like ECS with AWS. So there's a lot of I know like Palo Alto has stuff like that. ThreatStack. There's a lot of companies out there that are beginning to focus on container security. So instead of you having to take this hard, weird problem, they simplify it and basically say, hey, here's a system and here's some agents you can deploy within your dependencies for your build. And this will actually scan. This will give you an idea of what dependencies what CVEs are linked to what specific dependencies within the build. And then from there, you can you can customize or you can apply a severity rating to that. So you understand that, hey, this part of our build that's responsible for processing registration has, this CVE 2020 1472 or something like that has like a CVE that's fairly popular and that attackers are leveraging on a day-to-day basis, right? So now I know, hey, we need to focus there. Because if this is all new to you, going into static and dynamic analysis, that's going to be a much harder thing to pull off. But at least understanding what you can, what you should be monitoring and what you can apply focus to, I feel like that's an easier feat. So focusing on vulnerabilities around dependencies that are leveraged, potentially starting there.
Yeah, no, it sounds like at least from the way that you've presented that each of these core areas have like a key outcome or question that you're trying to get to for each one. And then another
Yeah.
question. So you've had the opportunity to like lead teams and be in different organizations and kind of help them out. What do you see as being like some of the bigger challenges in being able to kind of see this come to realization in more organizations?
Yeah, I think you can break that down into like two different buckets. One is the communication across the development teams and bringing them all together. I know that I think there may have been a talk today around like security champions, but that's like one of the biggest things is like how do you bring the development teams together and have a security resource that understands what the heck they're working on, but also understands how to implement tooling or processes and procedures to meet the security goals. That's super hard because there's not a lot of AppSec people out there. So what I tell people when I tell customers is like focus on building out some type of security championship program to kind of get you started, get you across the line. Have your developers take some of the training for the OWASP top 10 or OWASP top 20. Ensure that they understand that, and nominate someone to take on some of the security tasks because to finding the resource is going to be super super like difficult or extremely expensive. And then the second part
Absolutely.
of this is really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, and then the second part, if you can get the security champions part going, again, dedicating one resource, at least one, to really understand how to interject typical security charter mission statements into the development side of things. Most likely, what you're going to have to do is probably try to persuade one of the developers to come into the security world. That's the approach I've seen most companies take. Instead of trying to hire someone, they find someone interested in security and try to like persuade them to come over to this side.
Yeah, and this is, I guess, less of a question now, but more of a comment because you did mention that there's another talk on security champions, and I think yesterday we heard a talk from Justin Collins on why there shouldn't be any security champions in the future, and that we should find a way to make security everyone's job. So I think there's definitely multiple approaches to say like, hey, look, AppSec can't just do everything, but we need to see AppSec kind of mindset and capabilities dispersed throughout the organization. So really looking forward to see how other talks approach that going forward. But more importantly, thank you very much, O'Shea, for being here with us. As I'm saying to everybody, wish we could have had you, in another setting. But thank you
You
and
too.
mahalo to you.
Yeah, mahalo. See you later.